January 17, 1943, Wilhelmshaven, northern Germany. The morning arrived cold and pale, the kind of winter dawn that offered no warmth, only the promise of endurance. Along the North Sea coast, frost clung to the metal frames of Messerschmitt Bf 109s lined in neat rows across Luftwaffe airfields. Ground crews moved between the aircraft like shadows, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the salt carried inland from the churning gray waters. Pilots gathered in briefing rooms, smoking cigarettes, adjusting their leather gloves, listening to the hum of anticipation that preceded every scramble order. They had defended the Reich's skies for 3 years now. They had seen the RAF come by night, scattered and desperate. They had seen the French fall, the British retreat, the Russians bleed. But on this particular morning, something different approached from across the North Sea. Something the Luftwaffe had never encountered in such scale, in such formation, in such overwhelming mechanical certainty. The first radar stations picked up the contacts just after midday, blips on the screens distant and multiplying. Operators leaned closer, recounting, recalibrating their equipment, assuming malfunction. No force that large could be assembling. No air armada of that magnitude could possibly be real. But the blips continued to grow, spreading across the scopes like a dark stain bleeding through paper. Within minutes, the alert sirens screamed across every airfield within 100 kilometers. Pilots sprinted to their fighters, ground crews yanked away wheel chocks, engines roared to life in staggered symphony. And then, as the first Luftwaffe squadrons clawed their way into the pale winter sky, they saw it. The horizon had turned black, not with storm clouds, not with smoke or fog, but with bombers, hundreds of them, flying in formation so tight, so vast, so geometrically perfect that they seemed less like individual aircraft, and more like a single, monstrous organism blotting out the sky. Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, each one bristling with machine guns, each one carrying tons of high-explosive ordnance, each one part of a doctrine the Germans had not yet fully comprehended. This was not the scattered night raids of Bomber Command. This was daylight precision bombing. This was American air power, and it had arrived in force. The German pilots pulled back their canopies and stared upward, and in that moment many of them felt something they had not felt since the earliest days of the war. They felt fear. To understand the terror that seized those Luftwaffe pilots on that frozen January morning, one must first understand what they had been taught to believe. The German Air Force had entered the Second World War as the most modern, most tactically sophisticated aerial fighting force the world had ever seen. Under the command of Hermann Göring, himself a decorated fighter ace from the First World War, the Luftwaffe had been designed as a fast, mobile instrument of blitzkrieg, lightning war. Its Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were sleek predators built for speed and agility. Its pilots were trained in aggressive tactics, diving attacks, quick kills. The philosophy was simple: control the skies over the battlefield, destroy the enemy's air force on the ground, support the advancing panzer columns, and move on. The Luftwaffe was a sword, not a shield, and it had worked brilliantly. In Poland, in France, in the Low Countries, in Yugoslavia and Greece, the Luftwaffe had crushed all opposition. British Spitfires and Hurricanes had proven stubborn during the Battle of Britain, yes, but even that campaign had been a grinding stalemate rather than a defeat. German pilots returned from missions over London with tales of burning docks and shattered neighborhoods. Göring had promised that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. For a time, it seemed he might be right. But the Luftwaffe had been designed to win a short war. It had been built to dominate continental Europe, not to defend an entire Reich stretched thin across thousands of kilometers of hostile territory. And it had not been built to face the United States of America. When the Americans entered the war in December 1941, many German pilots barely noticed. America seemed distant, almost theoretical. The war was in Russia now, on the vast frozen steppes where entire armies vanished into the snow. The war was in North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps dueled with the British across endless deserts. What could America possibly contribute that would change the equation? They had no combat experience. Their equipment was untested. Their pilots were farm boys and factory workers playing at war. The Luftwaffe had faced the best Britain could offer and survived. Surely these newcomers would be no different. They were wrong. The United States had watched Europe burn for 2 years before entering the war, and in that time, American military planners had learned every lesson the conflict had to teach. They studied the fall of France, the failure of the Maginot Line, the effectiveness of combined arms. They watched the Battle of Britain and understood that air superiority was not a luxury but a necessity. And they looked at their own vast industrial capacity. The steel mills of Pittsburgh, the auto factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and realized that America could do something no other nation could do. America could build an air force so large, so powerful, so overwhelmingly numerous that it could simply drown the enemy in metal and fire. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was the embodiment of that philosophy. It was not elegant, it was not fast. It was a 4-engine heavy bomber designed to carry a 5-ton bomb load across 1,000 miles, drop it with precision, and fight its way home. Each B carried 13 .50 caliber machine guns mounted in turrets covering every angle of attack. The bombers flew in tight formations called combat boxes, overlapping fields of fire so dense that any fighter attempting to attack would be flying into a storm of bullets. The doctrine was called strategic bombing, and its logic was brutal in its simplicity. Destroy the enemy's ability to wage war. Bomb the factories. Bomb the oil refineries. Bomb the rail yards and the submarine pens and the ball-bearing plants. Make it impossible for the enemy to build tanks, to fuel aircraft, to move supplies. Bleed the Reich to death from the sky. By the beginning of 1943, the American 8th Air Force had assembled in England. Airbases spread across the East Anglian countryside filled with B-17s and their crews, 10 men per bomber, each one trained for a specific role. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, flight engineer, ball turret gunner, waist gunners, tail gunner. Most of them were barely 20 years old. Most had never left their home states before the war. Now they prepared to fly into the most defended airspace in the world. The first raids were small, tentative. A dozen bombers here, 2 dozen there, testing the defenses, learning the routes, refining the tactics. But the plan had always been escalation. More bombers, deeper targets, bigger formations. By January 1943, the 8th Air Force was ready to demonstrate what American industrial might look like when it took to the air. The target was Wilhelmshaven, Germany's primary U-boat construction facility on the North Sea. The force committed was over 90 B-17s, escorted by fighters as far as their limited range allowed. It was the largest American daylight raid over Europe to date, and when the Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept, their pilots looked up and saw the future. Lieutenant Hans Joachim Marseille, a Luftwaffe veteran with over 100 kills to his name, had once described air combat as an art form, a dance of speed and intuition where victory went to the boldest and most skillful. He spoke of the thrill of the diving attack, the satisfaction of a clean kill, the honor of single combat between skilled adversaries. But Marseille had died in North Africa in September 1942, and the war he had romanticized was already becoming obsolete. The pilots who climbed into their Messerschmitts on January 17, 1943, were about to experience a different kind of air combat entirely. The sky before their gunners could react. The Bf-109 screamed down through the cold air, their 20 cannons blazing. But as they entered range, the sky itself seemed to ignite. Every B-17 in the formation opened fire simultaneously. 50 caliber machine gun bullets, each one nearly as long as a man's hand, tore through the air in streams of tracer fire. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. German fighters that had survived years of combat over Russia and Britain suddenly found themselves flying through a hurricane of lead. Wings shredded, canopies shattered. Pilots died before they even understood what had hit them. Those who survived the first pass pulled away, their aircraft riddled with holes, their nerves shattered. They radioed back to their controllers, their voices tight with disbelief. They described the formations, how tight they were, how disciplined, how every bomber seemed to cover every other bomber. They described the firepower, more concentrated than anything they had encountered. They described the sheer number of bombers, more than they had ammunition to engage. And then the controllers ordered them to attack again. In the months and years that followed, this scene would repeat itself hundreds of times across the skies of the Third Reich. The Americans came by day, the British by night. The Luftwaffe bled itself white trying to stop them. German factories worked around the clock to produce more fighters, but American factories worked even faster to produce more bombers. For every B-17 shot down, 2 more appeared to take its place. For every German pilot who became an ace, 10 more died before earning their 10th kill. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was profound and devastating. These were men who had entered the war believing in their own superiority, in the invincibility of German engineering and tactics, in the righteousness of their cause. They had been told they were defending civilization against Bolshevism and plutocracy. They had been told they were the elite, the chosen, the best. Now they climbed into their cockpits each morning knowing they were likely flying to their deaths. Pilot diaries and post-war interviews reveal the depth of the trauma. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, who survived the war with 33 kills, described the American formations as flying fortresses indeed, impregnable castles in the sky. He wrote of watching friends die, of seeing experienced pilots with hundreds of missions simply vanish in a flash of fire and smoke. He described the helplessness of attacking a formation, firing every round he had, seeing his bullets strike home, and watching the bomber continue flying, seemingly impervious, dropping its bombs with mechanical precision before turning for home. Another pilot, whose name was lost to history but whose testimony was recorded by American interrogators, described the sound. Not the sound of engines or gunfire, but the sound the bombers made as they approached. A deep, throbbing drone that seemed to come from everywhere at once, that made the ground vibrate and the windows rattle, that announced with absolute certainty that destruction was coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. He said that sound invaded his dreams. He said he heard it even when the sky was empty. The Luftwaffe developed new tactics. They tried head-on attacks, diving through the formations at suicidal speeds, trying to break them apart. They tried heavy fighters like the Bf-110 and Me-410, twin-engine aircraft carrying. There was a particular cruelty in the way the Americans waged this air war, though it was not born of sadism, but of industrial logic. Every B-17 that took off from England carried not just bombs but data. The missions were meticulously planned. Intelligence officers studied reconnaissance photos, identified targets, calculated approach routes and bomb release points. Navigators plotted courses to the minute. Bombardiers trained for months to use the Norden bombsight, a mechanical computer that could drop bombs with unprecedented accuracy. After each mission, crews were debriefed, damage assessments were compiled, lessons were learned, tactics were refined. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was improvising. Pilot training had been cut from 2 years to 6 months as casualties mounted. Fuel shortages meant fewer training flights. Aircraft production focused on quantity over quality. Experienced pilots were pushed to exhaustion, flying multiple sorties per day, their kill counts climbing while their life expectancy plummeted. The Luftwaffe was a force being consumed by attrition, and everyone involved knew it. German pilots began to recognize individual American bomber groups by their markings. They learned which formations flew tighter, which crews were more experienced, which targets would be most heavily defended. They developed a grim respect for their adversaries. These were not the clumsy amateurs they had expected. These were professionals, well-trained and well-equipped, executing a strategy with mechanical efficiency. And behind that strategy was a resource the Germans could not match: abundance. American bomber crews lived in a world of surplus that seemed almost obscene to their enemies. On English air bases, mess halls served bacon and eggs, fresh coffee, white bread, steaks, ice cream. Barracks had heating. Uniforms were replaced when worn. If a bomber came back damaged, it was repaired or replaced within days. If a crew was lost, a new crew arrived to take their place. The Americans had so many bombers that losses which would have crippled any other air force were absorbed as acceptable attrition. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of a nation that had transformed its entire economy for war. American factories produced more aluminum, more steel, more rubber, more aviation fuel than all of the Axis powers combined. Ford Motor Company alone produced more military vehicles than all of Italy. The Willow Run plant in Michigan turned out one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The United States launched more ships in 1943 than Japan built in the entire war. German pilots saw the evidence of this abundance every time they attacked a bomber formation. They shot down B-17s and watched them replaced the next day. They destroyed entire squadrons and watched them reformed within weeks. They inflicted casualties that should have broken morale, but the Americans just kept coming, wave after wave, formation after formation, month after month. And in their cockpits, exhausted and outnumbered, Luftwaffe pilots began to understand a terrible truth. They were not fighting an air force, they were fighting an economy, and they were losing. By the summer of 1943, the bombing campaign had evolved into a battle of mutual destruction. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at an unsustainable rate, sometimes 10% per mission, sometimes more. But they continued to fly. German cities burned. Factories were destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. Oil refineries exploded. Rail yards were cratered. The Reich's industrial capacity was being systematically dismantled. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense. Fighter production reached record levels. New aircraft like the Focke-Wulf FW-190 proved deadly in combat. Elite units like JG-1 and JG-26 became legends. Individual pilots achieved kill counts that seemed impossible. Erich Hartmann would finish the war with 352 victories, a record that will likely never be broken. But records and legends could not change the mathematics of attrition. For every bomber the Luftwaffe shot down, the Americans built 10 more. For every pilot Germany trained, America trained 100. The qualitative superiority of German pilots and aircraft was being drowned in quantitative American superiority. And then, in early 1944, everything changed again. The Americans introduced long-range escort fighters, P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks that could accompany the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Now German fighters had to fight not just through the defensive fire of the bomber formations, but through screens of American fighters with performance equal or superior to their own. The hunters became the hunted. Luftwaffe losses skyrocketed. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the German Air Force had lost control of its own skies. Pilots with weeks of training were thrown into combat against American aces with hundreds of flight hours. The life expectancy of a new German pilot dropped to a matter of days. Aircraft sat on the ground for lack of fuel. Factories producing fighters were themselves bombed into rubble. The black sky of bombers that had appeared over Wilhelmshaven in January 1943 had become a permanent fixture over the Reich. The terror that German pilots felt on that first encounter had hardened into grim resignation. They still flew, they still fought, but they knew, with the certainty of men who had seen too much, that they were defending a nation already defeated. The only question was how long it would take for everyone else to realize it. There is a particular object that appears again and again in the accounts of this air war, mentioned in diaries and memoirs and post-war interviews. It is not a weapon. It is not a medal or a trophy. It is a chocolate bar. American aircrews carried chocolate bars as part of their survival kits, compact, high-calorie emergency rations in case they were shot down. British children near the airbases knew that American airmen always had chocolate to hand out. German civilians who survived crashes and encountered American prisoners were often shocked to find chocolate among their possessions. Even in combat, even when their comrades were dying around them, the Americans had chocolate. This detail, small and seemingly trivial, became symbolic of something larger. Chocolate represented abundance. It represented a nation so wealthy, so productive, that it could afford to give its soldiers luxuries while fighting a global war. It represented the vast gulf between American material culture and the increasingly desperate scarcity of the Third Reich. German pilots, many of whom had not tasted chocolate in years, saw those rations and understood what they were really fighting. Not just an air force, but an entire civilization built on principles of mass production and consumption. A civilization that could afford to bomb its enemies with one hand while feeding its people with the other. A civilization that had turned warfare itself into an industrial process, mechanized and efficient and utterly without mercy. The chocolate bar, more than any fighter plane or bomb tonnage statistic, represented why Germany was losing the war. Because Germany was fighting with courage and skill and tactical brilliance, but America was fighting with factories and resources, and a productive capacity so vast it seemed almost supernatural. And in a total war, in a war of attrition, courage eventually runs out. Resources do not. The air war over Europe continued until the final days of the Third Reich. The last Luftwaffe fighters flew combat missions in April 1945, weeks before the surrender. Some pilots, aces with hundreds of missions, died in the war's final hours. Others landed their aircraft and walked away. The statistics are staggering. The United States produced over 18,000 B-17 flying fortresses during the war. Britain and America together dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on Germany. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 75% of its pilots over the course of the conflict. German cities were reduced to rubble. Industrial production collapsed. The vaunted German war machine, which had seemed unstoppable in 1940, had been systematically destroyed. But the true victory was not measured in tonnage or casualty figures. The true victory was psychological. By 1945, the Nazi ideology of racial superiority and inevitable triumph had been revealed as a hollow lie. The master race had been outproduced, outfought, and outthought by the very democracies it had dismissed as weak and decadent. The Luftwaffe, which had once symbolized German technological supremacy, had been driven from its own skies by American farm boys flying aircraft built in Michigan and Kansas. The pilots who survived carried the memory of those black skies for the rest of their lives. In interviews conducted decades after the war, elderly men who had once been fighter aces would pause, their eyes distant, and describe the sight of hundreds of bombers in formation. They spoke of it with a kind of awe, a reluctant respect for the power and determination it represented. Some admitted that they had known, even then, that Germany had lost the war. They had seen the future in those formations, and the future was American. On a cold January morning in 1943, the sky over northern Germany turned black with bombers, and the pilots who rose to meet them felt terror unlike anything they had known. It was not the simple fear of death that every combat pilot carries with him. It was something deeper and more existential, the fear of obsolescence, of fighting for a cause already lost, of being crushed beneath the wheels of a historical force too vast to comprehend. Those bombers were not just weapons. They were symbols of a different kind of civilization, one built not on the mythology of blood and soil, but on the practical logic of production and efficiency. They represented factories and assembly lines and supply chains stretching across oceans. They represented a democracy that could mobilize its entire population for war without terror or coercion. They represented the power of a free people who had chosen to fight, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed, rightly or wrongly, that their cause was just. And when the last bomber returned to England, when the last German fighter crashed into the earth, when the air raid sirens finally fell silent, what remained was a truth that no amount of propaganda could obscure. The future belonged to those who could produce, who could innovate, who could harness the full potential of their people and their resources. The future belonged to abundance, not scarcity, to openness, not domination, to the roar of engines and the hum of factories and the possibility of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things. The sky had turned black with bombers, and in that darkness, a light had been revealed. The light of a world where freedom and prosperity were not weaknesses but strengths, where democracy could be as powerful as dictatorship, where the future was